Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Wikiclick podcast. As always, this is Kyle Hellcamp. Uh, Today, as I was driving back home, I was listening to the radio and they mentioned Hajj, which is an Islamic a trip in Islam that most Muslims are required to take to the holy city of Mecca. And I realized I know a little bit about it, but I don't know much. So let's start today's Wikipedia article and Wikiclick adventure off at Hajj. The Hajj is an annual Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, the holiest city for Muslims, and a mandatory religious duty for Muslims that must be carried out at least once in their lifetime by all adult Muslims who are physically and financially capable of undertaking the journey and can support their family during their absence. Okay, so already it sounds like there's a lot of loopholes there that allow for some wiggle room if one is not in the position to make the journey. And that's good to know. Literally speaking, Hajj means heading to a place for the sake of visiting. In Islamic terminology, Hajj is a pilgrimage made to Kaaba, the house of God, in the sacred city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. The rites of Hajj, which go back to the time of Prophet Abraham, who built Kaaba after it had been first built by Prophet Adam, are performed over 5 or 6 days, beginning on the 8th and ending on the 13th day of Dhul al-Hijjah, the last month of the Islamic calendar. And this year, the last month begins on, I believe, August 12th. So the last day of their calendar is ending about when school starts. So it seems like kids are kind of on the same wavelength there as Muslims. They go, their year begins and ends when school starts, and it kind of makes sense, especially for growing seasons. Anyway, it is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, alongside Shahada, Salat, Zakat, and Psalm. Now, Shahada is an Islamic creed, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, declaring belief in the oneness of God, Tawheed, and the acceptance of Muhammad as God's prophet. Salat, or namaz, in some languages, is one of the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith. It is the physical, mental, and spiritual act of worship that is observed 5 times a day, every day, at prescribed times. Zakat is a form of almsgiving in Islam, which, by Quranic ranking, is next after prayer in importance. And Psalm is, in Islam, fasting. Let's see. Let's click on Psalm. And guys, normally I have trouble pronouncing even English words, so I'm going to be reading some Arabic language here. I'm going to butcher a lot of these pronunciations. I'll do my best to read them correctly, but forgive me ahead of time for any misspoken. Fasting in Islam. Fasting in Islam, known as Psalm or Sayam, the Arabic words for fasting, also commonly known as Ruza or Rosa in some Muslim countries, is the practice of abstaining, usually from food and drink. The observance of Psalm during the Islamic holy month of Ramadan is the 4th of the 5 pillars of Islam. Let's see. Let's click on Ramadan. I know that it's the holiest month in the Islamic calendar. Let's get the inside baseball in this holy month. Ramadan, also known as Ramazan, is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar and is observed by Muslims worldwide as a month of fasting, Psalm, to commemorate the first revelation of the Quran to Muhammad according to Islamic belief. This annual observance is regarded as one of the 5 pillars of Islam. The month lasts 29 to 30 days based on the visual sightings of the crescent moon, according to numerous biographical accounts compiled in the Hadiths. The word Ramadan comes from the Arabic root ramida, or ar-ramada, which means scorching heat or dryness. Fasting is fard, which is a word for obligatory, for adult Muslims, except those who are suffering from an illness, traveling, are elderly, pregnant, breastfeeding, diabetic, chronically ill, or menstruating. Fasting the month of Ramadan was made obligatory during the month of Sha'ban and the second year after the Muslims migrated from Mecca to Medina. Fatwas have been issued declaring that Muslims who live in regions with a natural phenomena, such as the midnight sun or polar night, should follow the timetable of Mecca, but the more commonly accepted opinion is that Muslims in those areas should follow the timetable of the closest country to them in which night can be distinguished from day. That makes sense. I know that there's actually a fairly sizable Muslim community in one of the furthest north cities in Canada. If you take the highway, I forget which one, but it's a major one. As far north as it goes, where it ends, there's like a community of 1,000 people, and I think like 100 or something are Islamic. So, unfortunately for them, if they were to follow the recommendations of fasting for Ramadan during that month, they would be in a lot of trouble. I also know, because the fasting begins and ends with the sun going down, that in the Burj Khalifa, the tall, big skyscraper in the Middle East, Muslims on the top floor actually have to fast, I think, for like 3 minutes longer than Muslims on the ground, just because the sun is visible from the top floor, I think 3 minutes longer. And it gets even more squirrely if you're an astronaut who is also a Muslim, of which I believe there has been one. And as time goes on, there will certainly be many more. While fasting from dawn until sunset, Muslims refrain from consuming food, drinking liquids, smoking, and engaging in sexual relations. Muslims are also instructed to refrain from sinful behavior that may negate the reward of fasting, such as false speech, which includes insulting, backbiting, cursing, lying, etc., and fighting, except in self-defense. Pre-fast meals before dawn are referred to as sahur, while the post-fast breaking feasts after sunset are called iftar. Spiritual rewards, which are called thawab, for fasting are also believed to be multiplied within the month of Ramadan. So it's like those video games that have XP bonus weekends. Muslims have that, but it's XP bonus month. Fasting for Muslims during Ramadan typically includes the increased offering of salat, prayers, recitation of the Quran, and an increase of doing good deeds and charity. Man, I gotta tell you, even though these are Arabic words, I'm knocking them out of the park. Let's go down and look at some of these. Let's see. Let's click on Ramadan in polar regions, because this is, Ramadan. It's obviously going to be a fairly large article. There's a section, Ramadan in polar regions. The length of the dawn to sunset time varies in different parts of the world according to summer or winter solstices of the sun. Most Muslims fast for 11 to 16 hours during Ramadan. However, in polar regions, the period between dawn and sunset may exceed 22 hours in summers. For example, in 2014, Muslims in Reykjavik, Iceland, and Trondheim, Norway, fasted almost 22 hours, while Muslims in Sydney, Australia, fasted for only about 11 hours. Muslims in areas where continuous night or day is observed during Ramadan follow the fasting hours in the nearest city where fasting is observed at dawn and sunset. Alternatively, Muslims may follow Mecca time. Jeez, man, bad luck polar Muslims here. They have to fast twice as long, and by the time they're eating the, let's see, was it the iftar? Let's scroll back up here. Yeah. By the time they're eating the post-break meal, the iftar, they also need to start on their suhoor, which is the pre-fasting meal. Jeez, guys, I feel sorry for you. Let me know if you're a Muslim living in polar regions, and let me know what that's like. Employment during Ramadan. Muslims will continue to work during Ramadan. The Prophet Muhammad said that it is important to keep a balance between worship and work. In some Muslim countries, such as Oman, however, working hours are shortened during Ramadan. And that would make sense to accommodate a large population practicing a specific. You're not going to want workers that are that cranky. You're not going to want ones that are working extremely hard who have to fast 11 hours. I can't imagine working like in a construction job or something on an empty stomach with no liquid. It is often recommended that working Muslims inform their employers if they are fasting, given the potential for the observance to impact performance at work. The extent to which Ramadan observers are protected by a religious accommodation varies by country. Policies putting them at a disadvantage compared to other employees have been met with discrimination claims in the United States and United Kingdom. There's a C also. Let's look at 5 pillars of Islam. It just seems like a Islamic heavy Wikipedia one. That's okay. I want to learn a little bit more about this religion. It's the second largest in the world, I believe, by number of people. Let's see. The 5 pillars of Islam are 5 basic acts in Islam, considered mandatory by believers and are foundations of the Muslim life. They are summarized in the famous Hadith of Gabriel. The Shia, Ahmadiyya, here we go again, and Sunni agree on the essential details for the performance and practice of these acts, but the Shia do not refer to them by the same name. C. Ancillaries of the Faith for the Twelvers and the 7 pillars of Ismailism. They make up Muslim life, prayer, concern for the needy, self-purification, and the pilgrimage if one is able. Let's see. Let's scroll down here. We did look up the pillars, but to recap, Shahada, which is faith, and the declaration that there is no God but God, Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. It is essential to utter it to become Muslim and to convert to Islam. Salah, which is prayer, is the 5 daily prayers according to the Sunnah. The names are according to the prayer times. You have Fajr, which is dawn, Duhur, which is noon, Asr, afternoon, Maghrib, evening, and Isha, night. The Fajr prayer is performed before sunrise. Duhur is performed in the midday after the sun has surpassed its highest point. Asr is the evening prayer before sunset. Maghrib, evening prayer after sunset. And Isha, the night prayer. It might be fun to visit an Islamic country one day, but I think I would be a little annoyed at having the call to prayer waking me up each morning. Sorry, Muslims, but I gotta sleep in. This is one I can get behind. Zakat, charity, or almsgiving, is a practice of charitable giving based on the accumulated wealth. Scrolling down, it says there are 5 principles that should be followed when giving to zakat. The giver must declare to God his intention to give zakat. So I assume you pray to Allah and say, Allah, I'm going to give X percentage of my wealth to charity. The zakat must be paid on the day that it is due. So I guess that day you give to charity. After the offering, the payer must not exaggerate on spending his money more than usual means. So I guess don't promise one thing and give another. Payment must be in kind. This means if one is wealthy, then he or she needs to pay a portion of their income. If a person does not have much money, then they should compensate for it in different ways, such as good deeds and good behavior toward others. That's something I think we could all do. Rich or poor, I think that probably number 4 should be something that everyone strives to reach. The zakat must be distributed in the community from which it was taken. That makes sense. You don't want to go to New York and give your zakat if you don't live there. You want to it's kind of like the saying, what they say, charity starts at home. And that makes sense. Psalm, fasting, is... there are 3 types of fasting. Siyam are recognized by the Quran. Ritual fasting. Fasting is compensation for repentance. And ascetic fasting from Al-Azhab. Ritual fasting is an obligatory act during the month of Ramadan, and we already know about that. Then going down to Hajj, and that was where we started. Let's scroll back up. The Hadith of Gabriel, that kind of caught my eye, and I've only got one to catch, so better obey. In Sunni Islam, the Hadith of Gabriel is the single most important hadith, or report on the words and actions of the Islamic prophet Muhammad, the last prophet of Islam. Its narrative contains the best summary of the core of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam, the 6 articles of faith, and the ihsan, or doing what is beautiful. That's a good philosophy. This hadith is found in both the Sahih al-Bukhari and the Sahih Muslim. The hadith is known to express the religion of Islam in a nutshell. Let's look up the ihsan, doing what is beautiful. I know that in Islamic culture, you have very beautiful ornate architecture and calligraphy, and it's just absolutely fascinating. So let's look a little bit into this. Ihsan is an Arabic term meaning perfection or excellence. It is a matter of taking one's inner faith, iman, and showing it in both deed and action. A sense of social responsibility born from religious convictions. In Islam, ihsan is the Muslim responsibility to obtain perfection or excellence in worship, such that Muslims try to worship God as if they see him, and although they cannot see him, they undoubtedly believe that he is constantly watching over them. That definition comes from the Hadith of Gabriel, in which Muhammad states, Ihsan is to worship God as though you see him, and if you cannot see him, then indeed he sees you. Ihsan, meaning to do beautiful things, is one of the 3 dimensions of the Islamic religion. Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. Iman denotes a believer's faith in the metaphysical aspects of Islam. Let's see. Let's look up Iman. Let's look up Iman. Iman, in Islamic theology, denotes a believer's faith in the metaphysical aspects of Islam. Its most simple definition is a belief in the 6 articles of faith, known as Arkan al-Iman. The term Iman has been delineated in both the Quran and the Hadith of Gabriel. According to the Quran, Iman must be accompanied by righteous deeds, and the 2 together are necessary for entry into paradise. Let's see. Let's look at the 6 articles of faith. Scroll down here. Belief in Allah, the only God. Belief in angels. Belief in holy books. Quran is in parentheses. Belief in the prophets. Belief in the day of judgment. And belief in God's predestination. Let's look up the belief in day of judgment. I'm a fan of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic and dystopian literature. And while I'm pretty familiar with the Christian interpretation of it, with the rapture and the day of judgment and Satan ruling over Earth for 7 years and then God kicking his butt and ruling for 1,000, I don't know too much about the Islamic one. And I do know that Islam borrows a lot from Christianity and that many of the same prophets you see in the Bible are reflected and respected in Islam. But I don't know too much about their apocalypse. So let's look this up. Islamic eschatology. Side note, apparently I can pronounce Arabic words just phenomenally, but when it comes to my own language, forget about it. Islamic eschatology is the branch of Islamic theology concerning the end of the world and the day of resurrection. After that, known as Yom al-Qiyamah, the Arabic, the day of resurrection, or the day of judgment, when the annihilation of all life will be followed by its resurrection and judgment by God. When al-Qiyamah will happen is not specified, but according to prophecy, primarily elaborated by the Hadith literature, there are major and minor signs that will foretell its coming. Many verses in the Quran mention the Last Judgment. Let's see if they signs the end times. Let's click on these and get the juicy tidbits. The minor signs. The coming of fitna, or which means tribulations, and removal of khushu, which means the fearfulness of God. So people will stop fearing God, and tribulations will come. The coming of 30 Dajjals, each one of them presuming himself an apostle of God. And Dajjal is an evil figure in Islamic eschatology. So there will be 30 people, each of them believing themselves an apostle of God, but they're all evil. A person passing by a grave might say to another, I wish it were my abode. So you have people who long for death. This seems very similar to the Christian interpretation of the end times. Because I think they said something along the lines of, they will long for death, but death will not come. In Islam, they pass by a grave and say, God, I wish I was dead. The loss of honesty and authority put in the hands of those who do not deserve it, so the corrupted being the ones given power. The loss of knowledge and the prevalence of religious ignorance. Frequent, sudden, and unexpected deaths. Increase in pointless killings. Acceleration of time. I don't know what that means. Maybe it seems like maybe time will go quicker. I can understand that, yeah. Rejection of hadith, which means the hadith will be rejected. The spread of riba, which means usury or interest. So interest will spread. The spread of zina, which means adultery or fornication. And the drinking of alcohol. Well, I drink alcohol. sorry, Islam, but got to get that heart health up. And I don't get drunk, but I do like to take a little bit of red wine to kind of have a little bit of health benefits. Widespread acceptance of music. That one seems peculiar. I guess music is just not considered halal in Islam. Pride and competition in the decoration of mosques. I think that's kind of a funny one. I like to imagine two mosques on opposite sides of the street, each one trying to outdo the other with more and more intricate and ornate decorations. Women will increase in number and men will decrease in number. So much so that 50 women will be looked after by one man. Yikes. Those men were nagged to death. Am I right, fellas? No, but the implications of that would be seriously horrifying. Could you imagine a society in which such a disproportionate number? I mean, ladies, jokes aside, I have no problem with you, but imagine if it were the other way around. I wonder what some of these. I wonder, and it's always fun to imagine what would cause some of these situations in the real world. And by real world, I mean what real world events. Not to poo-poo your faith, guys, but what real world events would lead to such a thing? You know, because there are logical, rational reasons for why you would have the spread of adultery or rejection of hadith, or even the perceived duration of time. But I wonder, maybe some sort of hormone in the water. They're turning the freaking frogs gay. It's your 5 minutes of Alex Jones, your 5 seconds of Alex Jones. The abundance of earthquakes, frequent occurrences of disgrace, distortion, and defamation. When people wish to die because of the severe trials and tribulations that they are suffering. So that kind of goes back up to the looking at a grave and saying, I wish that was me. Jews fighting Muslims. That one probably could apply to any point in period in time when the two groups exist. So any time from the 7th century AD until probably the last either Jew or Muslim exists. When paying charity becomes a burden, nomads will compete in the construction of very tall buildings. We kind of have that in the Middle East now. Women will appear naked despite their being dressed. I guess that's kind of a take on Western culture and the skimpiness of outfits. People will seek knowledge from misguided and straying scholars. Fake news. Liars will be believed, honest people disbelieved, and faithful people called traitors. the death of righteous, knowledgeable people, the emergence of indecency, and enmity toward relatives and neighbors. Man, there's a lot of these minor signs. The rise of idolatry. I'm about halfway through. I'm going to continue, though. The rise of idolatry and polytheists in the community. The Euphrates will uncover a mountain of gold. Ooh, I'm there, baby. The land of the Arabs will return to being a land of rivers and fields. Maybe kind of mentioning climate change, perhaps. The Romans will form a majority amongst people. When I say Romans, I don't believe they mean like the ethnic Romans. I believe the Romanesque interpretation of law. The Romans back in the day, and I guess during the Islamic period, it would have been the Byzantines, were much more authoritarian, kind of straightforward, strict rule of law. And you see it in the Bible too, where Jesus say, "Render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." You have obviously two different trains of thought about who is to rule what aspects of life. So I'm imagining when it says this, and again, I'm no scholar, but I think that when it says the Romans will form a majority amongst the people, it would mean the statists, the non-religious, the secular, the ones that would put more faith in the state than God, I believe. Don't quote me on that. People will increasingly earn money by unlawful haram ways. There will be much rain but little vegetation. Evil people will be expelled from Medina. Wild animals will communicate with humans, and humans will communicate with objects. It's kind of a bizarre one. Lightning and thunder will become more prevalent. There will be a special greeting for people of distinction. Trade will become so widespread that a woman will help her husband in business. The horrors. No, but I don't think that it means that these signs are themselves bad. Some of them, at least. I think that this is just merely saying that trade before the end times will become that widespread, that women will be required just to compete. They will be required to help their husband with business. No truly honest man will remain, and no one will be trusted. Only the worst people will be left. They will not know any good, nor forbid any evil, i.e., no one will say there is no God but Allah. And I don't know if it means that the good will die out, or if over time, because society is itself so corrupted, that good people will themselves become twisted as well, or those who would normally be good, and a, let's say, more ambivalent society would be corrupted. Nations will call each other to destroy Islam by any and every means. Islamic knowledge will be passed on, but no one will follow it correctly. I'm sure that there's probably a lot of people who believe that that's true of every faith. It gets passed on, but these darn kids just don't follow it like I used to. Muslim rulers will come who do not follow the guidance and tradition of the Sunnah. Some of their men will have the hearts of devils and a human body. Stinginess will become more widespread, and honorable people will perish. A man will obey his wife and disobey his mother, and treat his friend kindly while shunning his father. So I guess it means that the social contracts will be kind of thrown up in the air. Voices will be raised in the mosques. That seems kind of a very, very small sign. I'm sure that there's probably been a lot of rabble-rousing in the past. The leader of a people will be the worst of them. No comment on current political whatever. People will treat a man with respect because they fear the evil he could do. Much wine will be drunk. Sorry, Islam, but that's me. I don't drink too much, but I do consume it pretty regularly. And again, pointing this out, there are noticeable health benefits to those who drink red wine. This only applies to if you're an adult, and only applies to maybe a glass a night, not even enough to get a buzz. So kids, don't drink red wine until you're older, because your heart's not even going to start falling apart until like your 40s. And don't drink on it, obviously. Muslims shall fight against a nation who wear shoes made of hair and with faces like hammered shields. with red complexions and small eyes. That's an interesting kind of vivid description. Almost makes it like a devil nation. Hammered shields, red complexions, and small eyes. Kind of, I don't know. The emergence of the Sufyani within the Syria region. And the Sufani is a character from Islamic eschatology. And it refers to descent from the it looks like a rival, sort of rival, almost like an antichrist. The truce and joint Roman-Muslim campaign against a common enemy, followed by El Malhama al-Kubra, which means Armageddon, a Roman versus Muslim war. The black standard will come from Khorasan. Nothing shall turn them back until it is planted in Jerusalem. The black standard is one of the flags flown by Muhammad in Islamic tradition. Looks like just a plain black flag. And the Khorasan is a historic region lying in the northeast of Greater Persia. Quran will be forgotten and no one will recall its verses. All Islamic knowledge will be lost to the extent that people will not say La ilaha illallah, which means there is no God but Allah. Instead, old people will babble without understanding God, God. People will fornicate in the streets like donkeys. The first trumpet blow will be sounded by Israfil, which I believe is an angel. All that is in heaven and earth will be stunned and die except what God wills, and silence will envelop everything for 40 undetermined periods of time. There will be disagreement concerning secession. Then a man will emerge from Medina. He will hurry to Makkah, and the people of Makkah will come out to him and urge him and try to force him to accept bay'ah. He will be attacked, and the Kaaba will be destroyed. A pleasant breeze will blow from the south that shall cause all believers to die peacefully. It doesn't sound like a peaceful breeze. That sounds like the opposite of a peaceful, pleasant breeze. The moon will split in two, but non-believers will insist it isn't happening for real. There are two groups of Ummah whom God will free from fire, the group that invades India and the group that will be with Isa bin Maryam. So those are the minor ones. Oh, and one of the last minor signs, which will signal the coming of the 10 major, is the appearance of the Mahdi, which is the Redeemer of Islam. Now, a lot of these, those are 60 of them, many of them seem to follow the biblical interpretation of the end times. You have the society following the steps of depravity and evil ways, the God and the pure and the good and the religious kind of being forgotten in favor of the more secular. You have the secular kind of intruding of the Romans. It mentioned the joint Roman-Muslim campaign before the Roman or the state kind of swings back and bites the religious in the bum and attacks. You have many of these lands being overrun with death, abundance of earthquakes, and increase in lightning and thunder. It sounds like wars, rumors of wars, It sounds like a lot of these kind of, perhaps they had an understanding of human nature and understood what will cause the end in each case. So let's look at the 10 major signs. And again, they're probably similar because in Islam, they borrowed heavily from the Bible. The Bible is considered a sacred text in Islam, which many don't know. And so they probably looked at the Bible and said, yeah, this, and this, but kind of melded it for the Middle Eastern point of view. Because one of the major signs, the false Messiah, Antichrist, Masih ad-Dajjal, shall appear with great powers as a one-eyed man with his right eye. Oh, okay. I was going to say, not me, guys. Promise. But with his right eye blind and does look like a grape. Well, in my case, it's on the left eye that's blind. And it looks like a normal eye. It's just, I can't expose it to light without having some kind of pains. Although believers will not be deceived, he will claim to be God, to hold the keys to heaven and hell, and will lead many astray. In reality, his heaven is hell, and his hell is heaven. The Dajjal will be followed by 70,000 Jews of Isfahan wearing Persian shawls. They take note, guys. Here's the fashion of the followers of the Antichrist. The return of Isa, Jesus, from the 40 to Gaul. Okay, so even in Islamic scripture, they say that Jesus is going to overthrow this Antichrist. Yajuj and Majuj, which are Gog and Magog, a Japhetic tribe of vicious beings who had been imprisoned by Dul Quranya, which is he of the two horns, will break out. They will ravage the earth, drink all the water of Lake Tiberias, and kill all believers in their way. Isa, which was Jesus, Imam al-Mahdi, and the believers with them will go to the top of a mountain and pray for the destruction of Gog and Magog. God eventually will send disease and worms to wipe them out. 4. A huge black cloud of smoke will cover the earth. 5. Dabat al-Ard, or the beast that will come out of the ground to talk to people. 6. The sun will rise from the west. 7. 3 sinkings of the earth, 1 in the east. I'm not sure what that means. But it sounds like directions get all helter-skelter with the sun rising in the west. One of these sinkings will be in the west, and one in Arabia. The second blow of the trumpet will be sounded. The dead will return to life, and out of Yemen will come a fire that shall gather to all of Mashar al-Qiyami, the gathering for judgment. Ooh. So it sounds like this is very similar to a lot of what Christians believe in terms of the end times. Let's see. Let's look at Gog and Magog, or in the Islamic faith, Yajuj and Majuj, because I've heard Gog and Magog, and it's kind of a funny word to say. Gog and Magog in the Hebrew Bible may be individuals, peoples, or lands. A prophesied enemy of God's people according to the book of Ezekiel, and according to Genesis, one of the nations descended from Japheth, son of Noah. The Gog prophecy is meant to be fulfilled at the approach of what is called the end of days, but not necessarily the end of the world. Okay, so the world continues, but the days, I guess it makes sense. The civilization sees the last of its light, but the world keeps traveling on. Jewish eschatology viewed Gog and Magog as enemies to be defeated by the Messiah, which will usher in the age of the Messiah. Christianity's interpretations are more apocalyptic, making Gog and Magog allies of Satan against God at the end of the millennium, as can be read in the book of Revelation. A legend was attached to Gog and Magog by the time of the Roman period, and that the gates of Alexander were erected by Alexander the Great to repel the tribe. Romanized Jewish historian Josephus knew them as the nation descended from Magog the Japhetite, as in Genesis, and explained them to be the Scythians. In the hands of early Christian writers, they became apocalyptic hordes, and throughout the medieval period, variously identified as the Huns, Khazars, Mongols, Altaic people, or other nomads, or even the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Let's see. Let's look up Josephus. Click on him. We're kind of getting into more secular territory here, which is not so bad, because I know that the internet's filled with very mature people who would never spend time flaming each other over religious differences, and in fact are extremely accepting of one another's differences. But hypothetically, let's say they're not. Maybe go into more secular territory. That's not to say I won't touch religion in the future. There's some interesting takes in Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism that I do later want to have episodes kind of dedicated to. And, we'll probably touch back on Islam, because these are very major events and major cultural pieces of humanity. And I think that ignoring them is probably worse than diving in from a more mature, semi-objective point of view. I know that it's impossible to be 100% objective, but I do, while making kind of quips regarding each of these faiths, I respect the differences and the cultures that come with it. And hey, if you're one of these faithful, you do you, and you do you as best as possible. What was it that we learned? Uh, Iman, make that which is perfect and beautiful. So anyway, that aside, let's look up Josephus. Was a first century Romano-Jewish scholar, historian, and hagiographer. I probably just need to go back to Arabic words. I can't pronounce any European. Hagiographer is a biographer of a saint or an ecclesiastical leader who was born in Jerusalem, then of Roman Judea, to a father of priestly descent and a mother who claimed royal ancestry. He initially fought against the Romans during the First Jewish-Roman War as head of Jewish forces in Galilee, until surrendering in 67 AD to Roman forces, led by Vespasian after 6-week siege of Jotapata. Josephus claimed the Jewish messianic prophecies that initiated the First Roman-Jewish War made reference to Vespasian becoming emperor of Rome. In response, Vespasian decided to keep Josephus as a slave and presumably interpreter. After Vespasian became emperor in 69 CE, he granted Josephus his freedom, at which time Josephus assumed the emperor's family name of Flavius. Flavius Josephus fully defected to the Roman side and was granted Roman citizenship. He became an advisor and friend of Vespasian's son Titus, serving as his translator when Titus led the siege of Jerusalem. Since the siege proved ineffective at stopping the Jewish revolt, the city's destruction and the looting and destruction of Herod's temple soon followed. So it sounds like he started on one end and went to the other. Josephus recorded Jewish history with special emphasis on the 1st century CE and the First Jewish-Roman War, including the siege of Masada. His most important works were the Jewish War and the Entities of the Jews, first one being written in 75 AD and the second one in 94, roughly thereabouts. The Jewish War recounts the Jewish revolt against the Roman occupation, and Antiquities of the Jews recounts the history of the world from a Jewish perspective for an ostensibly Greek and Roman audience. These works provide valuable insight into the first century Judaism and the background of early Christianity. Let's click on Herod's temple, because it says in parentheses it was the second temple. Reconstruction of the temple under Herod. Oh, so this is halfway down a normal article. The second temple was the Jewish holy temple which stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during the Second Temple period, between 516 BC and 70 CE. According to Jewish tradition, it replaces Solomon's temple, the first temple, which was destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 586 BC, when Jerusalem was conquered and part of the population of the Kingdom of Judah was taken into exile to Babylon. Let's look up Solomon's temple. I know, once again, an article, a Wikiclick section that goes into history. I can't help it. I love history. According to the Hebrew Bible, Solomon's temple, also known as the First Temple, was the holy temple in ancient Jerusalem before its destruction by Nebuchadnezzar II after the siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC, and its subsequent replacement with the Second Temple in the 6th century BC. The Hebrew Bible states that it was constructed under Solomon, king of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, and that during the Kingdom of Judah, the temple was dedicated to Yahweh and is said to have housed the Ark of the Covenant. Jewish historian Josephus says that the temple was burnt 470 years, 6 months, and 10 days after it was built, although rabbinic sources state that the first temple stood for 410 years, based on the 2nd century work Seder Olam Rabbah. Placed construction in 832 BC and destruction in 422 BC, 165 years later than secular estimates. Because of the religious sensitivities involved and the politically volatile situation in Jerusalem, only limited archaeological surveys of the Temple Mount have been conducted. No archaeological excavations have been allowed on the Temple Mount during modern times. Therefore, there are very few pieces of archaeological evidence for the existence of Solomon's Temple. an ivory pomegranate which mentions priests in the house of blank 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 H, and an inscription according to the temple's restoration under Jehoas, have both appeared in the antiquities market, but their authenticity has been challenged and they are the subject of controversy. Let's scroll up and look up Ark of the Covenant, because I know that it's that one thing in Indiana Jones that kills Nazis when they look at it directly. The Ark of the Covenant, also known as of the Testimony, is a gold-covered wooden chest with a lid cover described in the book of Exodus as containing 2 stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. According to various texts within the Hebrew Bible, it also contained Aaron's rod and a pot of manna. Hebrews 9:4 describes the Ark of the Covenant was covered on all sides with gold, in which a golden jar holding the manna, and Aaron's rod which budded, and the tables of the covenant. The biblical account relates that approximately 1 year after the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, the ark was created according to the pattern given to Moses by God, when the Israelites were encamped at the foot of the biblical mountain. Thereafter, the gold-plated acacia chest was carried by its staves while en route by the Levites, approximately 2,000 cubits, roughly 80 meters or 2,600 feet, and the people when on the march or before the Israelite army, the host of fighting men. So it was carried about half a mile ahead of everybody else. When carried, the ark was always hidden under a large veil made of skins and blue cloth, always carefully concealed, even from the eyes of the priests and the Levites who carried it. God was said to have spoken with Moses from between the 2 cherubim, on the ark's cover. For the rest, the tabernacle was set up, and the holy ark was placed under the veil of the covering, the staves of it crossing the middle sidebars, holding it up off the ground. Let's see. Can look up possible locations. Since its disappearance from the biblical narrative, there have been numerous claims of having discovered or of having possession of the ark, and several possible places have been suggested for its location, and there are quite a few here. It seems there's a mount. It seems Ethiopia is making a claim, Southern Africa, places in Europe, France, one that's currently in the United States, Rome, United Kingdom. I don't think there are guys. Let's scroll up and look at the rod of Aaron, or Aaron's rod, sorry. Aaron's rod refers to any of the staves carried by Moses' brother Aaron in the Torah. The Bible tells how, along with Moses' rod, Aaron's rod was endowed with miraculous power during the plagues of Egypt that preceded the Exodus. There are 2 occasions where the Bible tells of the rod's power. Tell me, this sounds like an RPG weapon. Whenever I read biblical accounts, I always think of the cool items that they're mentioned there, and I'm thinking, man, if someone decided to compile all these, they would make one really cool RPG, I bet. If done right. In the culture of Israelites, the rod was a natural symbol of authority, as the tool used by the shepherd to correct and guide his flock. Moses' rod is, in fact, cited in Exodus 4:2 as carried by him while he tended his sheep, and later, Exodus 4:20 becomes his symbol of authority over the Israelites. The rods both Moses and Aaron were endowed with miraculous power during the plagues of Egypt. God commanded Moses to raise his rod over the Red Sea when it was to be parted, and in prayer over Israel, Moses brings forth water from a stone using his rod. Aaron's rod, however, is cited twice as exhibiting miraculous power on its own, when not physically in the grasp of its owner. In Exodus 7, God sends Moses and Aaron to the Pharaoh once more, instructing Aaron that when the Pharaoh demands to see a miracle, he has to cast down his rod and it will become a serpent. When he does so, the Pharaoh counter by similarly casting down their own rods, which also become serpents, but Aaron's rod swallows them all. That's interesting. I remember the DreamWorks movie, The Prince of Egypt, and they have a reference to that, but it was Moses carrying it. So, in fact, it seems like the true biblical account, or, well, true insofar as you believe it, but the actual the historical document mentions that this was actually Aaron's rod. The Pharaoh's heart But Aaron's rod swallows them all. The Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, and he chooses to ignore this bit of symbolic warning, and so the plagues of Egypt ensue. Notably, this chapter begins with God telling Moses, "Behold, I have made you as God to the Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet." As God transmits his word through his prophets to his people, so Moses will transmit God's message through Aaron to the Pharaoh. The prophet's task was to speak God's work on God. He was God's mouth. At number 17, Korah's rebellion against Moses' proclamation of the tribe of Levi as the priesthood has been quashed, and the congregation's ensuing rebellion has resulted in a plague, ending only by the intercession of Moses and Aaron. In order to stop the complaints of the Israelites, God commands that each of the 12 tribes provide a rod, and only that of the tribe chosen priests will miraculously sprout overnight. Aaron provides his rod to represent the tribe of Levi, and it puts forth buds, produced blossoms, and bore ripe almonds. As an evidence of the exclusive right to the priesthood of the tribe of Levi, in commemoration of this decision, it was commanded that the rod be put again before the testimony. According to the tradition, the rod of Aaron bore sweet on one side and bitter on the other. If the Israelites followed the Lord, the sweet almonds would be ripe and edible, but if they were to forsake the path of the Lord, the bitter almonds would predominate. A book of Christian Bible seems to assert that the rod was kept in the Ark of the Covenant. So it seems like in order to kind of figure out who was in charge of who, these 12 tribes, each of them was to provide a rod, and those who were chosen by God would have their rod bloom. And Aaron seemed sprouted the blossoms, buds, and almonds. And when tried again, it seems like one side was producing sweet, the other bitter, and it kind of represented the rewards and punishments for either following God or not. All right, so about almost 53 minutes in, seems like as good a time as any to end. So let's summarize what we learned today. We started off with Hajj because it is currently ongoing in the Middle East. We learned that is the trip that Muslims take to the Kaaba, which is the most holy site in all of Musliminity, Islam. And it's located in the holy city of Mecca. We learned that this pilgrimage is one of the 5 pillars, and one of those is fasting or Psalm, in which case Muslims have to fast they begin fasting before the sun rises or as the sun rises, and then end it after the sun sets. We learned that this most notably occurs during the holy month of Ramadan, which takes place in the summer months, and it's the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. We learned that because the fasting begins and ends with the sunrise, that there are some very unfortunate people out there who live in polar regions and will have to fast for much longer. It's mentioned here that even though there are some situations where you have the midnight sun, where the sun never goes down, most people choose the nearest city to them where they go down. So that in Muslims living in Iceland and Norway, while they fasted for 22 hours, those in Australia only fasted for 11. We learned that there are 2 meals. There's a pre-fast meal and a post-fast meal, so that those living 22-hour fasting period, they're starting on one meal, they're ending the other. We learned that employment during Ramadan, you kind of have to tell your boss, hey, listen, I'm Muslim, I'm fasting. I'm probably going to be a little bit more ornery, probably a little bit more sluggish, and that religious accommodations are sometimes met with that. But it's recommended that you keep working as much as possible during this. We looked up the 5 pillars of Islam, the Shahada, faith, which is the pronunciation that there's only one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Salah, prayer, which has the Fajr, dawn, Duhur, noon, Asr, afternoon, Maghrib, Maghrib, evening, and Isha, night. So you got the 5 prayers. You have Zakat, which is charity and almsgiving. Psalm, fasting, and Hajj, which is the pilgrimage, which we've mentioned. From there, we looked up. Let's see, what else did we look up? Oh man, looks like I clicked on the wrong one, and I do know that we looked up the what was it? Oh dear, I clicked on something and it took me on the wrong path. Eesh. We looked up. Oh, I know that we looked up the fasting, and you don't have to fast if you're diabetic or elderly. I know that we looked up the Hadith of Gabriel, which is the supposedly single most important hadith, and it mentions the 5 pillars of Islam, the 6 articles of faith, and Ihsan, which is doing well. The 6 articles of faith that we clicked on mention the belief in Allah, belief in angels, the belief in the holy books of the Quran, the belief in prophets, belief in the day of judgment, and the belief in God's predestination. We clicked on the belief in judgment, the end times, as it were, and we read the minor and major signs, and we took note that these are actually very similar to the ones that are reflected in the Bible. Let's see, what else did we click on? We clicked on Yajuj and Majuj, which are Gog and Magog. And these were the people, according to the book of Ezekiel and Genesis, one of the nations descended from Japheth. Let's see. We scrolled down, read a little bit more, and we read about the believe we. Oh, this is a little odd. I accidentally clicked on something. The Josephus, didn't we? Yes, we clicked on Josephus from here. I'm back on track, guys. Don't worry. Josephus was the Jewish Roman historian who actually started Jewish and later became Roman and wrote some important works that scholars currently study to kind of get insight into first century Judaism, the kind of political ins and outs of the time, and give a little insight into early Christianity. We looked from there. We went to the Herod's temple, which was the second temple. The first one being, and Herod's temple was destroyed, by the Romans. The first, and it was replacing Solomon's temple, which dates vary as to when that one was destroyed. Some give it about, it looks like roughly 400 years. Yeah, it had a good run while it was still around. And I think we clicked over here from the Ark of the Covenant, where we learned, because Indiana Jones, we learned that the Ark of the Covenant includes, in some stories, the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. We read about how the Ark communicated with Moses between 2 cherubim, because there were 2 statues, and the Ark was gold, and it was carried about half a mile in front of everyone. And on it were 2 cherubim, and that Moses, apparently it seemed like, stuck his head between them and got messages from God. But most of the time, the ark was to be covered in skins of blue cloth, skins, and blue cloth. So I guess no one was allowed to look at it, and it was to be covered in a kind of more royal. From there, we clicked on Aaron's rod, which was one of the rods that I guess was bore by Moses' brother Aaron, and it also has miracles associated with it. Because everyone knows about Moses, he raises his rod and splits the Red Sea, but Aaron's rod was the one that throws down on the ground, and it turns into a serpent, which eats the serpents created by the Pharaoh's magicians. We also know that the other miracle associated with this rod is the rebellion against Moses' proclamation of the tribe of Levi as the priesthood, that in order to stop complaints, I guess, of the superiority in the proclamation, God commands that each of the 12 tribes provide a rod, and only the tribe chosen to become priests will miraculously sprout overnight. So essentially, each of these 12 presented a rod, and Aaron, was the only one that sprouted. And it created blossoms and buds and leaves and almonds. And that when done a second time, because it was commanded the rod be put again before the testimony. I guess you don't want to just let one freak accident decide who's to be in charge of the priesthood. You better have 2 freak accidents. But the second time, it did the same thing, but on one side were sweet almonds and one side bitter, representing the different choices between following God and not. So that seems to be the end of the rabbit hole for this week's episode of the podcast. Guys, thank you so much for listening, and as always, I'll see you next time. Bye.